Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
Oh,
Today we're diving into something pretty profound. We're taking a look at Yogacara,
okay.
which is one of the two major schools of Mahayana Buddhism. It originated in India. And we're really going to kind of look at their ideas about the nature of mind and reality, which, is a pretty fundamental question that I think anyone who's kind of curious about how we experience the world,
Yeah.
how do we know what we know, those kinds of things. Um,
It's really a question for all of us. How do we perceive the world?
Right.
What is the nature of reality? These are big questions that Yogacara tackles head on.
Exactly. And what makes this deep dive so interesting is that we're primarily looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Yogacara.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a very rigorous expert level overview.
Hmm.
So we're really trying to distill the essence of this very complex and influential philosophical system. So it's kind of a shortcut, if you will, to understanding Yogacara.
Yeah, we're giving you the cheat sheet. You don't have to read hundreds of pages of dense philosophical text. Exacto. We've done it for you.
Yeah. And I think what I'm really excited to get into is their model of the mind
Yeah.
and what implications that has for understanding our experience. Like, do we see things as they really are? Or are we just seeing, like kind of a projection of our own minds?
What's really fascinating is that Yogacara really emphasizes that our minds are not just passive receivers of information, but rather our minds actively shape and construct our experience of reality.
Okay, so we are active participants in creating our reality.
Precisely.
In a way. Now, to give everyone a little context, Yogacara, its influence is pretty significant in Buddhist thought, especially across Asia, India, China, Japan, Tibet. And it's really made key contributions to metaphysics, epistemology, and the study of consciousness. So this is not just some fringe philosophical school.
No, this is a major player, and its influence is felt even today in modern psychology and philosophy of mind.
Absolutely. And to kind of give everyone a little preview of what we're going to be looking at, some key Yogacara doctrines that we'll be exploring include this idea of mind only, Citamatra, the theory of three natures, Trisvabhava, and their very intricate eightfold classification of consciousness.
Oh yeah, that's going to be fun. We're going to talk about the LA of Vijana, the storehouse consciousness. We're going to talk about the Kliyamanas, the defiled mind.
Yes.
These are some really interesting concepts that I think will resonate with anyone who's interested in exploring the nature of their own mind.
Absolutely. So I think this deep dive is going to be a great opportunity to kind of gain some insight into your own mind and how you see the world. So stick with us. We're going to unpack all of this together.
And, the goal here isn't to turn everyone into Yogacara experts, but rather to expose you to these fascinating ideas and to see how they might resonate with your own experience.
Exactly. We are just the guides, you are the one going through the journey. So let's start from the beginning. The name Yogacara. And followers are called Yogakaras. Pretty straightforward, right? But where did that name come from?
Well, the likely source, one possible source, is the Yogacarabhumi treatise, which if you translate that, it means the stages of Yogacara practice. So it's kind of like how you might call someone a Platonist,
Right.
because they follow Plato. Maybe Yogakaras
Right.
are those who engage in the stages of Yogacara practice.
Okay, so that makes sense. But what does Yogacara actually mean? Like if we break it down, yoga and akara, what are those two parts? What do they mean?
Right. Yoga. We often think of yoga as stretching and physical exercise.
Right.
But in this context, yoga refers to a kind of mental cultivation, meditation, mindfulness, really focusing on transforming the mind through practice. And akara simply means practice or conduct. So really, Yogacara is about this deep integration of contemplative practice and how that shapes our understanding of reality.
Okay, so it's not just about thinking about these ideas, it's about actually putting them into practice.
Exactly. You don't just read about Yogacara, you do Yogacara.
Okay, so active practice. Now, there are other names for Yogacara as well, right?
Yes.
Like what?
So some other names that are used for this school of thought include Vijnanavada, which means doctrine of consciousness.
Well, doctrine of consciousness. Okay.
You also have Citamatra,
Yeah.
which means mind only,
Okay, that's a good one.
and Vijaptimatra, which means cognition only.
Okay, cognition only. So what do those tell us about what Yogacara is all about?
Well, if you look at these names, you'll see they all point to this emphasis on the mind, on consciousness, on cognition as being central to Yogacara philosophy. And in particular, that idea of mind only. is really going to be a key theme that we'll explore throughout our conversation. It's the idea that ultimately there's only mind and everything else is a kind of appearance within that mind.
Okay, so that's pretty radical. I mean, that sounds a lot like idealism in Western philosophy.
Yes, and there are definitely some interesting parallels between Yogacara and Western idealism. But it's important to remember that Yogacara is rooted in Buddhist thought and practice, so it's not a direct one-to-one mapping onto Western philosophical concepts.
Okay, so similar but with its own distinct Buddhist flavor. Now let's talk a little bit about the origins of Yogacara, so like historically, and what were the main texts that kind of helped shape its philosophy?
Well, like many Mahayana Buddhist schools, Yogacara really holds the Prajnaparamita literature in high regard, which is, perfection of wisdom texts. These texts are really important because they emphasize the concept of emptiness, or the lack of inherent existence. And this idea of emptiness is really foundational for both Yogacara and Madhyamaka, which is another major school of Mahayana Buddhism.
Right.
So they share this common ground. But then Yogacara developed its own unique textual focus.
Okay, so what texts really stood out for Yogacara specifically?
There are a few sutras, which are discourses of the Buddha that became really prominent in Yogacara thought. So you have the Saddhanirmocana Sutra, which is often translated as Discourse Unraveling the Intent of the Buddha.
That's a long title.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's a really important text. You also have the Lankavatara Sutra, which is the discourse on the descent into Laika. And then you have this very important treatise, the Yogacara Gumi, which we mentioned earlier, the stages of Yogacara practice.
Okay, so these are some of the foundational texts. Now, what makes the Saddhanirmocana Sutra so important for Yogacara?
Well, the Saddhanirmocana Sutra is really interesting. It's considered the earliest sutra that presents Yogacara ideas distinctly. It probably emerged around the late 3rd century CE. And it lays out a lot of these key Yogacara doctrines, especially in its central chapters.
Okay.
And it was really influential for later Yogacaras, particularly Asaga and Vasubandhu. These are two key figures we'll talk about more later.
Right.
But what's really fascinating about this sutra is that it actually claims to represent the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma.
Third turning of the wheel of the Dharma, what does that mean?
So, the wheel of the Dharma is a metaphor for the Buddha's teachings. And the idea is that there have been 3 major turnings of this wheel throughout Buddhist history. And each turning represents a different emphasis or interpretation of the Buddha's teachings.
Okay.
So the Saddhanirmocana Sutra is basically saying, hey, we're the third turning. We're the most complete and definitive interpretation of the Buddha's teachings.
Wow, so they're really making a bold statement there. We've got it right.
Exactly. And this third turning idea really positions Yogacara as kind of surpassing earlier schools like the Abhiharma and Madhyamaka. So it's a really interesting claim, and it really shows how Yogacaras saw themselves within this broader Buddhist landscape.
Okay, so they saw themselves as kind of a culmination of Buddhist thought.
In a way, yes. They saw themselves as offering the most sophisticated and complete understanding of the Buddhist teachings.
Okay, very interesting. Now, what about the Yogacara Bhumi? You said it was a treatise. What makes it so important?
The Yogacara Gumi is massive. It's huge. And traditionally, it's attributed to Asaga or sometimes to his teacher, Maitreya.
Oh, wow.
Maitreya being the future Buddha. But most scholars today believe it's probably a compilation. So it's like different texts, different layers that were assembled over time.
Okay.
Kind of like how the Bible
Right.
is a collection of different
That's
books.
right.
And it has 2 main sections that are really well known. One is the Shuddhavakabhumi, which deals with practices that are relevant to kind of mainstream Buddhist practitioners.
Yeah.
And then you have the Bodhisattva Bhumi, which is all about the path of the Bodhisattva. And this is where we see some central Yogacara philosophical concepts being introduced.
Okay.
But here's a really important point. The Yogacara Bhumi, at least in its early stages, doesn't actually contain the fully developed Siddhamatra or mind-only doctrine that we often associate with later Yogacara.
Okay, so the text that kind of gives the school its name doesn't actually explicitly teach its most famous idea in its earliest form.
Exactly. It's kind of a fascinating twist. It shows that these ideas were developing over time, and that even the early Yogacaras might not have fully embraced the mind-only doctrine as we understand it today.
Okay, so it's not a static system. It's evolving. It's dynamic. Now, what about the Lankavatara Sutra?
The Lankavatara Sutra is also a bit of a mystery. Its dating is uncertain. Some scholars believe it might have appeared even after Vasubandhu, and they point to the fact that it uses concepts like the Alaya Vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, and the mind-only teaching. Neither Asaga nor Vasubandhu quote from it directly in their works that we know of, so it's a bit of a puzzle.
Okay.
But it did become a really influential text for Yogacara. And it does discuss things like the Alaya the mind-only perspective, and it also connects the Alaya with the idea of Tathagata, which is Buddha nature.
Oh, okay. So Buddha nature is kind of like the potential for enlightenment that's inherent in all beings, right?
Right. It's the idea that all beings have this potential to become Buddhas.
Okay. So we've got these various foundational texts, and some focus more on practice, some introduce these really radical ideas like mind only, but not always in a neat chronological order. It seems like things were pretty fluid back then.
Right. And it's important to remember that Buddhist thought wasn't a monolithic thing. There were different schools, different interpretations, different lineages, and they were all kind of interacting with each other, influencing each other.
So a very dynamic and interconnected intellectual landscape. Now, who were the key figures who really kind of took all these ideas and kind of synthesized them into a coherent, systematic philosophy?
It's really the brothers, Asaga and Vasubandhu,
Okay.
who are credited with kind of systematizing Yogacara and turning it into this distinct and influential school of Buddhist philosophy.
Okay, so they were like the master architects of Yogacara.
Right. They took these existing ideas and they really gave them a clear structure, a coherent framework. And they defended these ideas against other schools of thought.
Okay, so Asaga, what were some of his key contributions?
Well, Asaga is credited with writing a number of important works. Some of them are still debated, about their authenticity. But some of the key works that are attributed to him include the Abhidharma Samukaya, which offers a Yogacara perspective on Abhidharma categories, and then the Mahayana Sagraha, which is a really important overview of Yogacara theory and practice.
Okay.
So he was really a prolific writer, and he really helped to lay the groundwork for Yogacara as a distinct school of thought.
And then Vasubandhu, right? He's another big name.
Yeah, Vasubandhu is huge. He's known for his Abhidharma Kosha, which is a key text of the Abhidharma school.
Right.
But he actually kind of switched sides later on, and he wrote these really important Yogacara works, like the Vichika, which is 20 verses, and it's basically a defense of the mind-only doctrine. And then the Trishika, which is 30 verses, which is a really concise summary of Yogacara doctrines.
Okay, so he was a major player in both schools of thought.
Right. And that kind of shows how fluid things were. People weren't always strictly aligned with one school or another.
Okay, so there was a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. Now let's dive into one of the most unique aspects of Yogacara, which is their philosophical psychology, specifically their model of the 8 consciousnesses. So how does this model differ from earlier Buddhist views of the mind?
Well, the traditional Abhidharma psychology, which predates Yogacara, generally talk about 6 types of consciousness. So you have the 5 senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching.
Right.
And then you have mental consciousness, manovijana.
Okay.
So that makes 6. But Yogacara adds 2 more.
Oh, okay.
So they introduce the kliyamanas, which is often translated as the defiled mind or the afflicted mind. And then they introduce the alaya vijana, which is the storehouse consciousness or the substratum consciousness.
Okay, so 2 new players on the scene. Now, we still have the familiar 5 senses and the mental consciousness. So how do these 2 new additions fit into the overall picture? How do they all work together?
Right. So those initial 6, the 5 senses and manovijana, they're often grouped together as the manifesting or the occurrent consciousnesses. And the technical term for that is prativijana.
Prativijana. Okay.
It's a mouthful. But essentially, this term highlights a couple of key things. First, it distinguishes them from the kliyamanas and the alaya vijana, which operate at a more subtle kind of background level of the mind.
Okay.
And second, it points out that while the alaya vijana is functioning continuously, these 6 consciousnesses arise more intermittently. So, for example, they're not active during deep sleep
Okay.
or when their specific objects aren't present. So if you're not seeing anything, your visual consciousness is not active.
Right.
But the alaya vijana is always there in the background.
Okay, so these are the consciousnesses that we're most directly aware of in our everyday waking life.
Exactly. They're the ones that are kind of front and center in our experience.
Now, what about the kliyamanas? What does it do? Like, what's its role?
The kliyamanas is really important in Yogacara. It's seen as the source of our mistaken belief in a permanent, independent self. So, you know how we tend to think of ourselves as this I that exists over time that has a fixed identity?
Right, the ego.
Exactly. The kliyamanas is what's responsible for that. It's characterized by these 4 fundamental afflictions or defilements.
Okay.
So You have the false view of self, which is Atmane.
Okay.
You have delusion or ignorance about the nature of self, which is Atmamaha.
Okay.
You have self-conceit or pride, which is Atmamana.
Okay.
And then you have self-love or attachment to self, which is Atmasneha.
Wow. So it's like the headquarters for all of our self-centeredness.
Exactly. It's where our ego really takes root
Hmm.
and where all these negative emotions and thoughts that are associated with the ego arise from.
Okay. Now, how did this idea of the Kliyamanas come about? Like, where did it originate in Yogacara thought?
Well, one influential theory suggests that it came from the observation that the alaya vijnana itself, that storehouse consciousness that's operating kind of beneath our conscious awareness, it becomes the object of our more subtle, self-related thoughts and feelings.
Okay.
So it's like, even though we're not consciously aware of it, we're still kind of referencing ourselves in a very subtle way all the time.
Right, like a background process.
Right. And so to account for this constant underlying process of self-referencing, the Yogacara has posited this distinct Kaliyamanas that's kind of like constantly latching onto and conceptualizing the Alaya Vijnana as if it were a real, enduring self.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the mind needs a specific function to construct this illusion of I.
So it's like a tool that the mind uses to create this sense of self.
Exactly. And there's also this possible influence from Sakya philosophy,
Hmm.
which is another Indian philosophical system. And in Sakya, they have this concept of ahakara, which literally means I maker
I maker. Okay.
or egoism. So it's likely that this concept of ahakara from Sakya also played a role in shaping the Yogacara understanding of the Kliyamanas.
Okay, so it's like a convergence of different ideas that led to this very unique concept. Now, how does the Kliyamanas relate to the other consciousnesses? Like, for example, our everyday mental consciousness, the Manovijnana.
Right. So in traditional Abhidharma, the five sense consciousnesses, they each have a corresponding sense organ as their basis. Like your eyes are the basis for visual consciousness.
Right.
But Madhavijnana, mental consciousness, was considered to have only a past basis, meaning it relied on previous mental states.
Okay.
But Yogacara, especially in texts like the Mahanasagraha, they propose that the Kliyamanas acts as the simultaneous basis for Madhavijnana. So it's kind of like a more immediate foundation for our thinking processes.
Okay.
So it's not just about the illusion of self. It's also a fundamental support system for all our thoughts and judgments.
So it's like the ground from which all our thinking arises.
Precisely. It's the fertile soil where our thoughts and concepts take root.
Now, since the Kliyamanas is considered defiled or afflicted, how does that affect the way we experience the world?
Well, because the Kliyamanas is constantly operating, it's always there in the background with its egoistic tendencies.
Right.
It inevitably kind of colors all our other consciousnesses.
Okay.
So it's like we're always looking at the world through these ego-tinted glasses. And as a result, we tend to misinterpret our experiences as interactions between separate independent selves and objects. So we see ourselves as separate from the world, and we see other people as separate from us. And this fundamental misperception is really the root of all our suffering, according to Yogacara.
So it's like a fundamental distortion of reality.
Exactly. It's like looking at the world through a warped lens. And this distortion is what keeps us trapped in Sasora, this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Okay, so it's not just a minor inconvenience. This is a major obstacle to liberation.
Absolutely. And Vasubandhu in the Trichika, he points out that this Kliyamanas, it's always operating. It only ceases in very specific states, like the attainment of liberation,
Okay.
or in the advanced stages of a Buddhist path, or in a very profound meditative state called Nirodhasamapati, which is basically absorption into cessation,
Okay.
where all mental activity, except the Alaya Vijnana, temporarily ceases.
Okay, so it's like a very deep state of meditative absorption.
Right. It's like a temporary suspension of all our normal mental activity.
Now, that brings us to the eighth consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana. This seems like a really key and really unique concept in Yogacara. So what exactly is it and what does it do?
The Alaya Vijnana is often translated as the storehouse consciousness,
Okay.
or the substratum consciousness. And that idea of a storehouse is really important
Okay.
because one of its main functions is to hold karmic seeds, or latent impressions. The technical term for that is vasana.
Okay, vasana.
And these karmic seeds are basically the potential for future experiences. They're created by our past actions, both physical and mental. So every action we perform creates a karmic seed. And this seed is stored in the Alaya Vijnana.
Okay, so it's like a cosmic database of all our past karma.
Right. It's like a giant storage facility for all our karmic baggage.
Now, how does this concept of the laya vijnana help to explain the continuity of karma, especially in the context of the Buddhist doctrine of no self?
Right, that's one of the really important functions of the Alaya Vijnana. It provides a way to explain how the effects of our past actions can continue to influence us,
Okay.
even though there's no permanent, unchanging self.
Right, because if there's no self, then who's carrying the karma?
Exactly. So the Alaya Vijnana provides this kind of continuity. It's like a stream of consciousness that flows from one life to the next,
Okay.
and it carries these karmic seeds with it. And when the conditions are right, these seeds ripen and they manifest as experiences in our lives. So it's like a causal mechanism that operates without needing a self to be the carrier of karma.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you also mentioned a connection between the Alaya vijnana and deep meditative states.
Right. Some scholars believe that the Alaya Vijnana might have actually originated from attempts to understand what happens in deep meditation, especially in Nirodha Samapatti, which is absorption into cessation.
Right, that state of complete mental stillness.
Right. So the question is, if all mental activity ceases in this state, how does the meditator remain alive?
Right.
And how does consciousness reemerge?
Right.
And the idea is that the Alaya Vijnana persists, even when all the other consciousnesses have ceased.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the ground of consciousness. It's the foundation that allows for the reemergence of consciousness after this deep meditative state.
Okay, so it's like a kind of backup generator for consciousness.
In a way, yes.
Uh-huh.
It's what keeps the lights on even when everything else shuts down.
Now, what other roles does the Alaya vijnana play in the Yogacara system?
So besides explaining karmic continuity and providing a basis for consciousness in deep meditation, the Alaya Vijnana also plays a crucial role in explaining life processes. It's seen as the consciousness that takes hold at the moment of conception. It's what sustains the physical body throughout life, and then it's what withdraws at the time of death.
Wow.
So it's kind of like the thread that connects one life to the next.
Okay, so it's not just about mental stuff, it's actually involved in our physical existence as well.
Right. And it's also really important in an idealist framework. Because in Yogacara, the Ayurveda is what explains how we perceive the world.
Oh, okay.
So instead of saying that our perceptions are caused by external objects, Yogacara says that our perceptions arise from the ripening of seeds in the Ayurveda.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the world we perceive is a projection of our own minds.
Okay, so it's a very mind-centric view of reality.
Exactly. And it can even account for intersubjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we seem to share the same world with other people.
Okay.
Because the idea is that similar past actions can create similar seeds in the Alaya of different individuals.
Okay.
So we might perceive the world in similar ways because we have similar karmic histories.
Okay, so it's like a kind of karmic resonance.
Right. It's like we're all tuned to similar frequencies based on our past actions.
Now, given all these functions of the Alaya vijnana, especially its role in continuity, I'm wondering if the Yogacaras were ever accused of essentially bringing back the idea of a permanent self, like the Atman.
Right. That's a really good question. And yes, they were accused of that. Because it does seem like the Alaya Vijnana is doing a lot of things that we might normally associate with the self.
Right.
But the Yogacaras, they really pushed back against this accusation. And they emphasized that the Alaya Vijnana is not a static, unchanging entity. It's not like a soul. They often use the analogy of a flowing river.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the river is constantly changing. You know, the water molecules are different from moment to moment.
Right.
But the river itself persists.
Right.
So the Alaya Vijnana is like that. It's a flow of karmic seeds that's constantly changing.
Okay.
But it does provide a certain continuity. And crucially, they also argue that the Alaya Vijnana ceases upon liberation.
Okay.
So when you attain nirvana, the Alaya Vijnana dissolves.
Okay, so it's not eternal.
Right. It's not a permanent fixture of reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that arises due to our ignorance and our karma. And when we eliminate those things, the Alaya Vijnana ceases to exist.
Okay, so it's like a temporary condition.
Exactly. It's not who we really are.
Now, were there any specific arguments that the Yogacaras used to try and prove the existence of this Alaya vijnana?
Yeah, in the Yogacara Bhumi, there's a set of 8 arguments that are presented to kind of demonstrate why we need to posit the existence of the Alaya Vijnana.
Okay.
So some of these arguments we've already touched on,
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that it explains the continuity between death and rebirth,
Right.
and the fact that it provides a basis for life to continue even in unconscious states,
Right.
like in Nirodha or deep sleep or fainting.
Right.
But there were other arguments too, like They argued that the alaya vijnana is necessary to explain how we can have bodily sensations in meditation,
Okay.
even when there's no external tactile perception.
Mm.
So, for example, if you're meditating and you feel a tingling sensation in your body,
Right.
but you're not actually touching anything,
Right.
how do you explain that?
Right.
And Yogacara says, well, that's because of the alaya vijnana.
Okay.
It's kind of like the alaya vijnana is generating these internal sensations.
Okay, so it's like a source of internal experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also argue that it's necessary to explain why we can have different types of consciousness arising in quick succession.
Okay.
So, for example, you can have a wholesome thought followed immediately by an unwholesome thought.
Right.
And they say, well, these two types of consciousness are so different in nature, they couldn't possibly arise directly from each other.
Right.
There has to be some kind of underlying foundation that holds the potential for both types of consciousness. And that's the alaya vijnana.
Okay.
It's kind of like the neutral ground from which all these different types of consciousness can emerge.
Okay, so it's like the common denominator of our mental experience.
Exactly. And then another important argument is that it explains how we can have multiple sense perceptions simultaneously
Okay.
and yet still have a unified sense of awareness.
Right.
So, you can see, hear, smell, taste, touch all at the same time.
Right.
But you don't experience those things as 5 separate streams of consciousness.
Right. It all comes together as one experience.
Right. It's all integrated into one coherent experience. And Yogacara says that's because of the alaya vijnana.
Okay.
It's what allows for this simultaneous ripening of multiple karmic seeds.
Right.
And this creates the unified field of experience that we have.
Okay, so it's like the conductor of the orchestra.
Exactly. It's what harmonizes all the different instruments.
Now, you also mentioned earlier that the alayev